Welcome to the session 2 of Energy Security and Green Infrastructure Week, the UK's National Awareness Week and the biggest green energy conference. Big thanks as well also to our sponsors for Energy Security and Green Infrastructure Week, the Energy Research Accelerator, ERA. My name is Andy Walker. I'm a construction and infrastructure journalist and editor of Infrastructure Insights website. I'm just waiting for our speakers to join us in the room for this next session, and I believe that they are already here. And I'm sure that on my instruction they will put their cameras on so that we can see them in the room as well. So I'm just going to wait for that to happen, and then basically we will begin this very important session, which is entitled Powering Britain's Future, Securing Clean, Reliable and Affordable Energy. And in this session, we're going to hear from 3 leading voices from across the energy sector who are going to explore just what it will take to deliver clean, resilient and affordable power for the UK. In this session, we've got 3 great speakers who are going to address all of that. We've got Virginia Crosbie, who's board director at the Nuclear Institute, and she'll be setting out why nuclear needs to be central to Britain's clean energy and industrial strategy. We've also got Barnaby Wharton, who's head of flexibility and grid at RenewableUK, who's going to look at some of the technologies that will make a renewables-led system work in practice. And they include, of course, storage, hydrogen, and flexible demand, and also the policy choices needed to ensure system security. And then our final speaker is Sophie Lethier, who is Interim Deputy Director of Policy at Energy UK. And she's going to look at, I suppose, some of these issues through a political and economic lens, highlighting how government ambition, private sector investment and fair costings need to come together to deliver green power while protecting households and businesses. So we've actually got quite a lot to cover there. Just a couple of kind of housekeeping announcements, as it were. If you've got any questions for our panel or the whole panel collectively, then there's an icon on screen with a question mark at the top right hand corner of your screen with a little speech bubble in it. Just put your questions in there and we'll do our level best to try and get to those questions. We had stacks of questions in the last session. We got to most of them, but not all of them. And what we will endeavour to do is to continue the conversation, continue the debate on our LinkedIn channel. So keep an eye on that as well going forward. And we'll post a selection of the questions on there so that we can keep that conversation going. If I can just ask our speakers to unveil themselves, to put their cameras on so that we can get into this particular session. I'm going to start the session with Barnaby Wharton, who is, as I said, head of flexibility and grid at Renewable UK. Barnaby is obviously very experienced in this particular area. He leads on strategy on the technologies and infrastructure needed to deliver a net zero power system. His work covers green hydrogen, long duration storage, flexibility and electricity networks, and shaping the market and regulatory frameworks that enable investment in clean energy. He also sits on several government delivery boards and advises on system reform. Barnaby, the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you very much, and thank you for that introduction. It saves me having to remember how to do that one. For those that don't know Renewable UK, though, we are a trade association for the renewable sector, many of you will know sort of as the, I guess, the Wind Trade Association. But as you mentioned yesterday, we're obviously building out a huge amount of wind, and being very successful in that. Yesterday we saw AR7 announcements, 8-point-something gigawatts of wind, which is going to take the total offshore wind pipeline of kind of built and contracted to over 35 gigawatts, which is second only to China in terms of capacity, and is probably going to be about half of the UK's offshore wind capacity. So offshore wind is going to be a huge part of the future system. And similarly, onshore wind, we're now building out with onshore wind CFD results due in the coming weeks. Currently got 15 gigawatts of onshore wind on the system, and that's going to get to around 27, 30 gigawatts under the Clean Power 2030. And then obviously we're going to be building out the solar side of things as well. Again, under Clean Power, as much as 45, 47 gigawatts of solar. So we're seeing this enormous change on the system, moving from a kind of fossil fuels dominated system through to a renewables dominated system. And this brings with it huge change, and we need to make sure that we are managing that change in the right way. And I guess that's kind of where the work that I do and the work that RenewableUK is increasingly focusing is, when we build out all this wind, what else do you need on the system to ensure that functions effectively? Because people are still shocked to discover, I find, that the wind does not always blow and the sun does not always shine, which people like to remind me, but it's something that we are very well aware of. But it does need addressing, and just because it's something that is kind of plainly obvious doesn't mean we should ignore it. So I guess one of the first things to do is, how do we handle a system where you have a increasingly cheap but intermittent resource source of power? And there are a number of things that we need to do. Firstly, it is managing that variability in output of wind, and that variability can extend from minute by minute. There are gusts. Wind generation on individual wind farms can be very variable over the short term. So how do you kind of manage that and smooth that out? But then there are also these periods of longer time when you don't have the high volumes of wind, and then people, I'm sure, have by now heard of the Dunkelflaute phrase. Those long kind of periods of low output, particularly in winter when it may also be a bit chilly. So at the moment, we're managing that through primarily the gas fleet. If we want to decarbonise the power system, we need to think of other ways of doing that. Batteries are going to clearly play a huge role. I'll come a bit more into kind of the role of batteries in a second, but managing that short duration variability from batteries is going to be an incredibly important part of the picture. Batteries generally generating, providing power, previously 1 to 2 hours, but we're starting to see the duration of batteries extending out to as much as 10 or 12 hours. So managing that kind of intraday, minute by minute side of things is going to be important, but we also need to think about what is that long-term solution to kind of the Dunkelflaute if we're going to move away from gas, and that's where your very long duration storage comes from. Pumped hydro, we haven't built a new pumped hydro power station in over 40 years now. We need more pumped hydro, and that's coming forward through the cap and floor system. But the other part of the picture I think is going to be really important is green hydrogen. And we're going to have these periods not just of low wind, but also very high wind output when the demand isn't there. So how do we use that excess wind, not wasting it, not turning wind farms down, but instead using that, I think, to produce hydrogen, using electricity to split water, produce and store hydrogen in very, very large volumes. And then you have a store of hydrogen that can then be used either for industrial purposes or to be pushed back into the power system via hydrogen CCGTs. And that cycle of excess wind, produce, store hydrogen back into the power system is going to be an absolutely crucial part of handling these long periods of low wind output. The other thing I think is really important for us to think about is system stability. People, I'm sure, are familiar with inertia, voltage control, frequency response. These things that keep the system running smoothly. We need to maintain that 50 hertz frequency on the system. Again, traditionally, that's been provided by thermal power plant, just spinning turbines. We don't have that direct comparison in wind. So we're going to need other mechanisms in order to do that. So what are the other technologies that are going to come forward? Battery is going to play a huge part in managing that process. Batteries are incredibly responsive. And for those that recall the power cut in August 2019, when we lost well over 1.5 gigawatts off the system following a lightning strike, which shorted a couple of power stations. Batteries responded, producing 450 megawatts of injection into the system in a fraction of a second, and that is absolutely crucial to stopping the system kind of having further damage on that day. And so batteries in that frequency response market, managing inertia voltage control, absolutely crucial. But we're also going to need spinning mass on the system. So sort of innovative things that are coming forward, not just very interesting power electronics and kind of artificial voltage and inertia, but also things like synchronous condensers. Can you just have basically big spinning disks dotted around the grid in order to help manage the system? So that's going to be a crucial part of that. And also things like, again, hydrogen CCGTs, and compressed air is something that could also provide liquid air storage, can provide that physical inertia for system stability. So I think the overall message is that we are moving to a high renewables system. It's going to be very different to the one we're used to, but the technologies are out there for us to enable that and facilitate that. It's really about how we ensure that they're coming forward. There's the market, there's the technology and innovation investment to bring it all forward in a way that comes together as a whole. And I think there's lots of work going on at the moment on that, but yeah, much more to do that I'm sure we'll dive into. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Barnaby. We're just waiting for one of our other panelists to join us. So while she sorts things out, and we'll certainly get back to some of those points that you raised there, Barnaby. Even in the last session, some of those issues, even though the session wasn't on that subject, were actually being raised. So it just shows you the saliency of those points, and also how very linked a lot of these issues are. But our next speaker is Sophie Lethier, who is the Interim Deputy Director of Policy at Energy UK. And Energy UK is the trade association for the energy industry. And Sophie leads the team which works on ensuring government policy and regulation supports investment in the power sector. So a fairly easy job there, really, keeping the government on track. And of course, that covers everything from the electricity market design to low carbon generation and flexibility as well. And Sophie has worked in the past in politics, both with local government leaders and parliamentarians. And as someone who's a keen student myself of the political process, I'm very much looking forward to hear Sophie give that kind of political dimension towards bringing all of this together so that we can actually achieve what we want to achieve, which at the end of the day is to secure clean, reliable and affordable energy for everybody. So with that in mind, Sophie, it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Andy, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me here. I think it's funny, I was drawing parallels to what Barnaby was talking about, because ultimately it's about managing the change and the transition in the right way, which is what you said, Barnaby, about kind of that change in technologies. But I think what I'll focus on more today is zooming out and providing that political context for the transition, as that's such a the consensus for the transition is a key enabler of decarbonisation and clean power. So if people aren't familiar with Energy UK, I'll start by introducing what we do. We're the trade association for the energy sector. We represent companies investing billions of pounds to secure our country's current and future energy needs. We represent the whole sector, so from major electricity generators, grid and infrastructure developers, energy suppliers. Our members are working across power, heat, transport and flexibility. And so as we're the only trade association that looks at the whole sector across a range of technologies, we really think we have a responsibility to bring this whole system perspective to the government. We're not just talking about one technology or technologies as a whole. We look at everything, and that's why we think it's sort of, when we're thinking about clean power and the clean power transition, it's important to maintain that holistic view. And so I think the thing that is at sort of front of mind for us and a priority for our work at Energy UK is understanding the politics of energy, but also how the politics of energy and the politics of energy costs are increasingly challenging, and more challenging than we've experienced in recent years. And that's, you know, despite the government's very clear ambition on clean power, which has brought a lot of focus and direction to the energy transition. So for some context, it's important to note that we're obviously in a persistent cost of living crisis, and affordability remains a concern for far, far too many people, with 6 million households living in fuel poverty. So that means that these people are facing the impossible choice between keeping warm and meeting other essential needs. And at the same time, we need to massively invest in our energy system to decarbonize our energy mix and our sources of electricity. And we need to build out and modernize our infrastructure. So we know that in the long term, a clean power system is the only way to permanently lower and stabilize bills. But in the short term, energy bills remain far, far too high. And so it means that, you know, affordability remains a concern for far too many people, but it also means that the cost of energy is under more and more scrutiny, and a range of technologies are coming under increased political pressure. So, you know, when we need to invest so much and there's so much scrutiny on energy costs and on energy investment, which is sort of a response that we saw to the hugely successful AR7 results yesterday, whilst it was really positive and the outcome was one which was shown to be leading to lower bills overall, that question on the cost of the strike price came up in the media, on social media as well. And so it's really, really important to maintain the consensus on the transition and on delivering net zero and supporting the government's clean power mission, that we should focus on achieving a transition at the lowest possible cost.
Thanks very much indeed, Sophie, for that. We seem to be having some issues with Virginia getting into the room from the Nuclear Institute, so we're just going to press on until she comes into the room. I've got some questions that I want to ask both Barnaby and Sophie anyway. First of all, Barnaby, you know, we're talking about I suppose the way the energy system is evolving and that focus on new technologies. How can technologies like storage, hydrogen and flexible demand work together to make a renewable power system reliable and, crucially, and this is an issue that comes up again and again and again, affordable?
I think the simple work is having the markets there. We need to bring all of these technologies forward. They need to see the investment case. So having the market frameworks in place so that we don't have to intervene directly, as NESO so often does, but instead these technologies can be selected as the system kind of needs them in the cheapest possible way. What we're seeing at the moment is, I think increasingly, if you look at the constraints issue, which I don't know if that was discussed on the grid session earlier, but we're increasingly seeing NESO intervene in the market to manage constraints on the grid. And that brings with it the additional costs. If we can move to a world where the market itself is resolving many of these issues, you can have NESO stepping out of the way, and that I think will help reduce costs. But what that means is that the markets themselves need to function. So I don't want to kind of get necessarily into things like skip rates, for example, which is where when the system is being balanced, more expensive gas plants are being selected over cheaper batteries to help manage the system. Now, there are some technical reasons why that may sometimes happen, but actually broadly, the battery is going to deliver a cheaper service to the grid, and we should be picking those up. So we need to ensure essentially that we have the markets, we know what we want on the system. NESO understands kind of what the system services are and then sets up the framework for those to be delivered in the cheapest possible way, rather than sort of ad hoc interventions to manage issues as they arise. So I think that's going to be absolutely critical, is really just ensuring that we understand what the system needs, we have the frameworks and markets in place, and then allow the technologies that can deliver those services step in as and when, and that will help bring costs down.
Thanks, Barnaby. I just want to move to Sophie now, and both in our introductory session, when we heard from our keynote speakers this morning, Neil McDermott from the Low Carbon Contracts Company and also Chris Stark from DESNZ, they were both, it was clear from what both of those were saying, and all of the speakers in our last panel, there's a lot of politics, obviously, around all of this, and I know that you're not here to answer for the politicians. God forbid that would be your role, Sophie, but you do actually work in that kind of environment. And the first question I wanted to ask you was, in your view, what more is needed to support investment in the power sector so that the government can deliver on its stated clean power mission? What would your view be on that?
Thanks, Andy. Sorry, I had some technical mishaps. No, I mean that's a really great question, and I think there is that challenge and that tension between affordability, lowering bills, maintaining consensus for the transition, at the same time delivering the urgent and essential investment that's required for a clean power system. That's a challenging balance to strike, but it can be done. So in terms of what more is needed, and what more is needed to support investment and to deliver the government's clean power mission, I think we should really commend the government for its ambition on clean power and all it's achieved to date. Its ambition on clean power and its focus and kind of priority on decarbonisation and decarbonising the electricity system has brought some significant achievements in the last 18 months. We've seen the Planning and Infrastructure Act gain royal assent. There's been some significant steps forward with investment in nuclear technologies, with Sizewell reaching final investment decision, the SMR competition announcing a winner. AR7 yesterday was the biggest auction in the UK, in Europe, and I think in the world outside of China. And earlier this year, we had the significant agreement between the UK and the EU to have linkage of our emissions trading schemes and a commitment to explore market coupling as well. So the Clean Power Mission is a Herculean task, but it's also a delivery agenda and has clear targets and clear timelines to support investment. And so whilst it is ambitious, it's really brought industry and government together that have been galvanized by this target. So there's sort of three things I think are key in the delivery of the Clean Power Mission. The first is a strong partnership between government and industry. That's going to be absolutely essential. The funding for the energy transition will be predominantly from the private sector, and in fact the Office of Budget Responsibility does put the cost of decarbonising the entire UK economy at 344 billion, with only a quarter coming from government funding. So the rest does rely on private sector funding. And private sector investment that's needed is significant across all technologies. And I'm just going to build on what Barnaby was saying, really. That really depends on having these kind of clear policy, regulatory and market frameworks that support investment in the technologies for clean power. And so as part of that clear policy and regulatory framework, some of the things that are essential will be continuing to address barriers that we're seeing with planning and grid connections, it'll be really important for the government to address uncertainty with market design. There was a lot of talk about yesterday's success, but I wonder how much of the uncertainty around network charging and TNUoS would have impacted that strike price. It does put pressure on bids, and that uncertainty raises the cost of capital. There is ongoing uncertainty with raw national pricing, and the government should really make progress on providing clarity on the sort of the direction with reform national pricing. Stronger cooperation with the EU, that will be really critical this year to supporting investment and trade. And then I think the thing that's important to remember as well is the need for sustained investment despite these fiscal pressures. Obviously, affordability is front of mind for government, but there's a way that you can address or at least intervene in a short-term way to seemingly reduce costs, but create longer-term challenges. And we saw that with the introduction of proposals to index inflation within the RO. The government was proposing a number of retrospective policy changes. And ultimately, whilst you might get some short-term savings, in the longer term, that creates a more challenging investment environment and would raise the cost of capital. And so that sort of that short-termist thinking is ultimately counterproductive. And so the final thing I wanted to say is that in terms of the sort of what's more is needed for the delivery of the government's Clean Power Mission, ultimately it's framing it in an equitable and fair way where costs and benefits are shared, and where there's a stronger focus on electrification and making electricity cheaper to support really critical technologies like heat pumps and EVs.
Thanks very much, Sophie, for that. I'm just going to check that we can hear from Virginia. We can't see her, but that's not a problem.
Yeah, hi, Andy.
That's great, fantastic. Yeah, right, stay where you are. I'm just going to introduce you, and then you can speak. So we do have in our virtual conference room here Virginia Crosbie, who's board director at the Nuclear Institute, and Virginia's going to speak now and set out why nuclear must be central to Britain's clean energy and industrial strategy. As well as being a board director of the Nuclear Institute, Virginia is also director of Nuclear Capital LLP. She's also a former MP for Ynis Môn between 2019 and 2024, so she'll be well aware of some of the political challenges and jiggery-pokery, if I dare call it that, that Sophie was alluding to earlier. She also chaired the all-party parliamentary group, easy for me to say, for small modular reactors, and served on the Nuclear Finance Bill committee. Unsurprisingly, Virginia is a leading advocate for new nuclear, and she was also instrumental in securing the government's commitment to build WILFA. So, Virginia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everybody. Lovely to be on the panel here and join you today, and nice to see Sophie and Barnaby. I do apologise. I started a new job as managing director of NEMO on Monday, and they have very strong firewalls here, so I do apologise. So essentially, sort of introduction, as you mentioned in terms of nuclear, Britain needs clean power that's secure, it needs power that is affordable, and it needs clean power that's deliverable. And, you know, I wholeheartedly agree that renewables are vital, but a renewables-led system still needs firm, always on, low carbon power to keep the lights on when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. So that's why nuclear must sit at the heart of our clean energy and also our industrial strategy. We've got one of the lowest productivities of any country. We need to get the cost of energy down if we're going to improve our industrial focus. And what it also does, it strengthens our energy sovereignty. We saw with Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine, there's a lot of concerns there, and it also reduces our exposure to gas price shocks and unlocks high value jobs, skills, and regional growth, particularly in the communities like Anglesey, where I had the privilege of being a Member of Parliament. So for me, I would say nuclear delivers clean electricity, and most importantly, it delivers clean certainty.
Thanks very much indeed, Virginia. I've got a question for you to kick off with straight away, and you kind of alluded to it when you just spoke there. How can nuclear energy underpin Britain's energy sovereignty and resilience in what is increasingly a renewables-led system?
Well, Andy, nuclear, it's the firm, sovereign backbone that makes a renewables-led system work at scale, and it's that at scale. And nuclear offers security, it offers resilience, and it reduces the reliance on imported gas and exposure to the global price volatility, and also geopolitical risk, which is becoming more and more of a concern. And nuclear is always on, it's always on clean power, and it provides dependable, low carbon electricity through all seasons and all weather conditions. And nuclear provides system stability. It's that grid reliability as we electrify heat, electrify transport, electrify industry, and reduces the need for that high cost emergency backup. And I think it's important here to also talk about lowering whole system costs. This firm power from nuclear, it's a key tool in balancing the system, and that's a very expensive thing to do. So if we include nuclear, the system is cheaper overall. And I'll end with saying that the sovereign capability, we need a sustained program that builds those domestic skills, that builds our supply chain depth and builds our exportable expertise, particularly with the likes of SMRs. And I was delighted with the news recently that Rolls-Royce will be building SMRs at Wilver on Anglesey. So with renewables, you get clean electrons, but I think it's fair to say nuclear gets you clean certainty.
Thanks for that, Virginia. I'm going to come back on some of the stuff around SMRs because there's a few questions in the thread on that. And just on questions, I've got a question for Barnaby that's coming from Gillian Baker. And she asks, when you state that green hydrogen is important as a storage mechanism for excess wind generation, do you expect that green hydrogen plants would operate intermittently? If so, what does this do to the business case for green hydrogen investments if running hours are restricted? Barnaby.
Really good question, a really important one. It will depend on the nature of the plant, its location, and the business model. So yes, if you are running something like a green hydrogen electrolyzer intermittently, the levelized cost of hydrogen does increase because you have to recover those capex costs over a sort of a fewer number of running hours. So that's absolutely important. But I think one of the other things to sort of recognize is that in a world where we are generating a huge amount of renewables, and there are going to be those periods where the system otherwise couldn't absorb that renewable power, the cost of that renewable input is going to be very, very low. So you will see an offset between the kind of the lower running hours maybe that the green hydrogen plant is running, but also a much lower cost of the input. So I think that there is a sort of the balance that the market will find there. But in a world where we're getting kind of well in excess of 100 gigawatts of wind generation at times, there's going to be a huge amount of excess power that we will need to put somewhere because it'll be more expensive to kind of turn that off otherwise. So it's a really great question, and I think the market is going to be there, but we need the market frameworks in place to enable all that to happen and find that price discovery. And the other thing to say is that as the green hydrogen industry grows and we're seeing huge expansion around the world, those capital costs are also going to come down, and we're going to see those costs being addressed, and therefore these issues around load factors will decline.
Thanks, Barnaby. I'm just going to nip back to Virginia. You talked about earlier about SMRs and SMR projects. What reforms are needed to attract more private capital and accelerate delivery of both large-scale and SMR projects? Have you got a view on that?
Great question, Andy. In terms of reforms, private capital flows when the UK offers predictability and standardization and this sort of bankable risk allocation. And what we need to address that is a credible long-term pipeline. Investors back a program. We need a fleet approach. We don't need these one-off projects. We need investors want to be thinking, do you know what? You've got government support, we've got off-takers, you know, that these are going to be long-term projects, and there's a pipeline. We also need stable revenue frameworks. The biggest cost for building nuclear power plants, particularly gigawatt, is reducing the cost of capital. And the way we can do that is with clear investable models. I was on the Nuclear Finance Bill Committee, and we introduced the RAB, the Regulated Asset-Based Model for funding nuclear, and in particular pertinent for SMRs. We also need bankable routes to market, including power, industrial users, data centers. We've seen, you know, the likes of Microsoft, Google, NVIDIA, all looking to actually have access to energy. And the whole AI sector is really growing exponentially. And last but not least, heat and hydrogen, which Barnaby talked about. We could also, private capital also benefits when there's faster and clearer decision making. So it's important to align government, to align planning, to align regulation, and also the grid connection. So we need to have this joined up thinking. Standardization and replication, fewer designs, repeated builds. When we've got Hinkley Point C and then going to Sizewell C, repeated builds, that's how you're going to drive the cost down and get the confidence up, rather than getting a reactor and then having another site with a different reactor and tweaking that reactor. We need to have this. I think that the phrase I want people to remember is this fleet mentality. And then we've got planning and siting certainty. And Wilbur is well known as one of the best sites for new nuclear in the UK, if not Europe. So getting these pre-identified sites and clearing the timelines. And the regulatory efficiency, let's have regulatory efficiency without lowering standards. Keep our world-class safety. We lead the world in terms of safety, but let's reduce duplication and properly resource the regulator. So in terms of capital, it's not scarce, Andy, and what is scarce is certainty, and the cost of delay is the most expensive energy policy.
Thanks, Virginia. I've got a question talking about investment and I suppose money at the end of the day. I've got a question from Kevin Kendall in the chat. He's addressed it at Sophie. Why is the and I asked this at the risk of opening up a wider discussion. Why is the UK budget for hydrogen less than £1 billion where nuclear is 30 billion? Discuss, Sophie. Always assuming that you're not the Chancellor of the Exchequer as well.
No, I mean that's an interesting question. I can't speak for the Chancellor, and I can't say that I know the exact reason why that is. Maybe Barnaby and Virginia might have some answers. What I can say is that we are waiting on some significant policy updates to hydrogen. And so we hope to have more information about the future of the hydrogen economy very soon, with the hydrogen strategy that was expected at the end of the year, and I understand is due imminently in government language. So hopefully that should provide some clarity for the direction of travel. A lot of business models are in development, and we need to understand how those business models ultimately fit together to progress the all elements of the hydrogen value chain in parallel, which is really important for this particular type of technology. Speaking to the nuclear point, we know that nuclear is a really key technology for a clean power system. So will hydrogen be as well. At Energy UK, we work with all technologies. But what we know with the investments that have been made recently in nuclear generation specifically is the huge amount of economic benefits that investment has. There is an outsized impact on the jobs, indirect and direct, that nuclear technologies support, how it contributes to the government's growth agenda. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but kind of putting the two technologies into context, and where the government has sort of landed on progressing policy for both of them. I don't know if Virginia and Barnaby want to add anything to what I've said.
Well, I'll come to Virginia in a minute, but I saw Barnaby kind of nodding his head and raising his eyebrows at various points during your reply there. Is there anything, that doesn't have to be, is there anything you wanted to add to that, Barnaby, before I bring in Virginia? Because I've got a particular question I want to ask her as well.
Yeah, hopefully I wasn't raising my eyebrows in skepticism. I mean,
no.
Absolutely right. I think, kind of think about that question. I think if you look at the kind of the scale of the two industries, Hinkley Point C, 3.2 gigawatts, a huge investment, a huge piece of engineering that clearly, in pure capital terms, is a lot. The first allocation round for green hydrogen secured, after my numbers, like 125 megawatts of green hydrogen capacity. So I think one of the reasons we see those very different numbers is just the scale of where hydrogen is. Green hydrogen is still a very young technology. We've been producing hydrogen from gas for decades now, but the green hydrogen sector and producing hydrogen from electrolysis at scale is still very young, still kind of working at small scale. So in due course, yes, there will be a lot more money in that sector, but right now I think it's getting it off the ground and getting it moving, and that's probably why you see some of that discrepancy. But I hope, as Sophie said, once we get the new hydrogen strategy out in the very near future, then we'll see hopefully more money and scaling up of the sector.
Thanks, Barnaby. Just moving back to Virginia and maybe addressing a question that's in the question list from Jane Goodman. She's asking how much nuclear capacity is required in the mix to provide energy security in the UK, e.g. how many new nuclear plants are anticipated for development in the next decade? Possibly an impossible question, possibly not. Virginia.
Well, I think more than we can actually provide. I mean, there's the goal of having 24 gigawatts by 2050, but the reality is we've got all but one of our nuclear power stations are going offline, and it's not just nuclear. We need to have hydrogen. I mean, Anglesey was known as Energy Island. We had hydrogen, we had wind, wave, solar, tidal, and now hopefully nuclear. But the goal is 24 gigawatts by 2050. But what I would say is when you speak to some of these, data centers and AI providers, they don't actually know how much they need. And my concern is if we don't have energy for our data centers, then our data is going to be exported to other countries in the world. And we certainly don't want that. We all talk about our energy security, but really that's a key part of that on an industrial, in terms of our industrial strategy. So we need, it's great news about Sizewell C. It's great news about Rolls-Royce SMR, and hopefully they're going to start with a few SMRs at Wilver, with the potential to go to 8 SMRs. But I think it goes back to this whole fleet mentality that I was talking about earlier. The great thing about SMRs is you can coexist them next to heavy energy use industries. So we're talking desalination, we're talking ceramics, we're talking data centers, we're talking fertilizer. The original Wilver was set up on Anglesey to provide electricity for an aluminium plant. And when Wilver had to close and be decommissioned, that aluminium plant had to close. So Anglesey lost thousands of jobs suddenly because we couldn't provide the energy for the aluminium plant. So it's great news about SMRs that they can go to these areas where there is the demand for heavy energy use, like we've seen with the Anglesey. But key is you can go to these areas that are they really need these good quality jobs. Anglesey's got one of the lowest GVAs gross value added of any constituency in the UK. And I'm really delighted that hopefully Rolls-Royce SMR will actually change the fortunes of so many people on the island.
Thanks, Virginia. I've got a question for all of you, actually, and it's come up a number of times, and it's come up in this session as well. And people have spoken about being more joined up and basically having the right frameworks in place. And really, this is a question on just that issue. So, are there policy or regulatory changes that are needed to support what we're trying to do here, i.e. create a secure low carbon electricity system? And if there are, then what are they to ensure that we actually achieve these aims? And I suppose as well, maybe when Virginia addresses that issue, are there any reforms that are needed to attract more private capital and accelerate some of the some of the delivery in this area as well? And also, if when people answer this question, they can also touch on briefly on the skills issue as well, because it's often said that this is all well and good as trying to achieve in these areas, but where are we as far as skills is concerned, and do we need more investment in that particular field as well? And I'm going to start with Sophie on that particular question. This will probably be our last question in this session as well. Sophie.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. This is a really, really interesting question, and one that comes up all the time as a theme, especially within Energy UK, where we do look at the whole system and see things in a joined up manner. A lot of our advocacy rests on the importance of having that holistic perspective to make sure that things are delivered in an efficient, coherent way. So I think one of the examples that I guess I've already given about policy and regulatory changes, with the hydrogen economy, it's as something as looking at ensuring all of the business models function together, and I think that's probably a broader theme across the policy and regulatory framework, is just ensuring that there is that consistency in approach. Where we're really seeing a need for joined up thinking, in my perspective, is everything to do with reform national pricing. At the moment, we had a decision earlier on last year, even as we're now in 2026, not to go forward with the implementation of zonal pricing that was being considered. And so now there is, reform national pricing. It covers a lot of reforms across the energy system, and it's being led by 3 different partners: DESNZ, Ofgem, and NESO. And it's one where that uncertainty that's being created by sort of not necessarily joined up delivery, we definitely see the need for more coordination and holistic thinking in that perspective. So if government is setting out a plan on locational signals and reforms that will influence siting decisions for projects, it will be really important that all policy areas that have some influence over siting decisions, whether that's seabed leasing, planning, or connections reform, or network charging, that all the signals align and point in the right direction. And then sort of finally, a slightly sort of zooming out a little bit more, as I did at the start of the session, I do think that the Clean Power Mission is about the generation, it is about decarbonising the electricity mix and getting more low carbon sources of electricity, but it's also about what that transition looks like for consumers and ensuring that it's done in a fair and affordable and equitable way. And so you can't separate the twin objectives of reducing bills and decarbonising the power system. It has to be looked at as a whole.
Thanks very much, Sophie. Barnaby, if you can be brief as well, because we've got about 5 minutes left.
I think Sophie was bang on the money there. So I mean, it is what does that whole picture look like? And I was thinking about the value chain from the point of generation, through the system, through the networks, to the consumers, and also who are the consumers. So for domestic users, how do we think about that value chain to drive down costs of domestic consumers, but also things like data centers, AI, which is obviously something that Virginia's talked about. So it's really looking at that whole system and who is going to do that. And we've seen with the Clean Power Action Plan, there are, I think, 80, 90 actions within that across the whole thing. So I think that has been a good example of looking at the whole picture. And we're seeing also the strategic spatial energy plan, looking at where is generation going to be, and then how do we then build a network to deliver that most efficiently. So we are kind of moving it towards that sort of joined up whole system thinking, but I think there's more to be done. And I think there are questions around what are the relevant roles of NESO, Ofgem and DESNZ within delivering that. And then just on skills, very briefly, yeah, we absolutely need to focus on skills. We are going through a huge change in the way we manage our power system in the UK, building out lots of grid, huge numbers of volumes of offshore wind. There's the nuclear side of things. How do we transition people between these industries? The oil and gas offshore industry moving into the offshore wind industry, thinking about passporting there, but also electricity. So can people shift between different parts of the power system, whether it's between nuclear, offshore wind, to energize these projects as well? So there needs to be a really big skills strategy to underpin this, because you're quite right, without the people to do it, it's not going to get done.
Thanks very much, Barnaby. And finally, Virginia, if you can.
Yeah, well, absolutely. We need to treat nuclear as a national industrial strategy, not just an energy project. And by turning this national industrial strategy with nuclear, turn it into a UK jobs engine, I think we can set UK content ambition, if we can support the tier 2, 3 suppliers, and if we can open procurement to SMEs. And let's talk about community benefits. Let's make them tangible. Let's have local contracts, housing, infrastructure planning, and community investment that's aligned to local priorities. I think particularly with these DCOs for these large infrastructure projects, it's a great opportunity to bring the community in and work with them. I've talked a little bit about co-location and co-generation, and let's use nuclear to anchor these industrial clusters and power for manufacturing, for industrial heat, for hydrogen that Sophie mentioned, and sustainable fuels, and these energy hungry growth sectors like data centers that Barnaby mentioned, and also place-based regeneration. In Anglesey, I fought to have a free port for Anglesey, but that goes hand in hand with nuclear being an anchor for ports in terms of innovation particularly, and creating an ecosystem, not just a single standalone site. And everyone's mentioned skills. It's absolutely vital. We need to have a skills pipeline. We've got destination nuclear. I love it when I drive in from Wales into London and I can see on the motorway those big signs that say destination nuclear, all about skills in nuclear, and having partnerships with colleges and universities, apprenticeships and reskilling. And these are careers, Andy. They're not jobs. These are careers. And I think the younger we can, let's go into primary schools and get people excited about nuclear. We led the way in the 50s and the 60s. We've got all the pieces of the jigsaw now. We just need to put that together with a strategy. And let's be really, really proud and put our stand up high and say, do you know what? The UK is leading once again in the nuclear sector.
Thanks very much, Virginia. Thanks to Barnaby, and thanks to Sophie for an engaging and fascinating discussion on a topic that, frankly, has got so many facets to it. And I think it's right and proper that we finished off in relation to skills and the future, because I think we have a real opportunity here, as far as the sector is concerned, to show, the nation, but particularly young people, that there is a real career to be had in the whole green infrastructure and green energy sector. So thanks again to Virginia, to Sophie and to Barnaby for their time this morning, and we will reconvene again in a few minutes time for session 3 of Energy Security and Green Infrastructure Week.